We're so happy you joined our September Business of Alt Protein seminar. Today, we're exploring a critical piece of the alternative protein puzzle, financing and commercialization. We'll be delving into insights and strategies drawn from the Good Food Institute's latest report, Funding the Build, which sheds light on how to navigate the financial landscape to scale and accelerate the growth of the sector. My name is Lane Clark, and I'm the Senior Corporate Engagement Manager of Innovation for GFI. Before we get started, I do have just a few housekeeping items. First, for those of you who may be new to the work of the Good Food Institute, we're an international nonprofit organization developing the roadmap for a sustainable, secure, and just protein supply. We identify the most effective solutions, mobilize resources and talent, and empower partners across the food system to make alternative proteins accessible, affordable, and delicious. Second, this seminar will be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel, and we will be emailing everyone who has registered a copy of the recording. And last but not least, please ask your questions in the Q&A box instead of the chat. This helps us keep track of everything more easily. You're welcome to ask questions throughout the seminar, but we'll likely be only able to get to them at the end. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker. Lopa Shah is a principal at Credible Futures with 20 years of diverse experience spanning renewable energy and infrastructure financing, nonprofit leadership, and alternative proteins. During her investment career at the International Finance Corporation, or IFC, the private sector investment arm of the World Bank Group, Lopa structured and mobilized more than $1 billion in financing for infrastructure and renewable energy projects in emerging markets. Lopa is the lead author of Funding the Build. She holds an MBA from the Wharton School and a dual degree in finance and international studies from the University of Pennsylvania's Huntsman program. And with that, I will hand it over to Lopa.
Thank you so much, Lane, and thank you all for joining our webinar today. It looks like a great turnout already just in the first few minutes. Today, I'll give you a quick overview before we begin. I'll start with a presentation of GFI's recent report, Funding the Build, which I see Sharon has just shared a link to that. If you haven't seen it, my presentation should take about 25 minutes or so, and then we'll have a panel discussion for the next 35 minutes where you'll get a chance to hear directly from our panelists that represent some of the capital pools that are funding alt proteins today. And we also have one company that is currently building a commercial facility. And finally, at the end, for the last 25 minutes or so, we'll have a Q&A session. As Lane mentioned, please do feel free to submit your questions along the way, and we'll get to them after the panel. I'd like to move to our agenda next. First, I'll give you context on where we started with this initiative and run through some of the top headlines. Then I'll talk briefly about the co-manufacturing decision, which really should precede a decision to build your own facility. Sections 4 and 5 are about building self-owned facilities, so the Capex requirements, how the target funding mix should change as a company scales. And I'll also give an overview of the funding landscape for the commercial stage. We'll then move on to two hot topics when it comes to financing large facilities. Those are project finance and long-term offtake. Many of you must have heard these topics a lot and talk about them yourselves. And then finally, we'll talk about pathways to unlocking additional capital. So first, where we started. In 2023, when the venture capital funding winter was taking hold, GFI found a growing number of alt protein companies that were ready to scale commercial manufacturing, but really struggling to find funding. The thinking at that time was that funding must be out there. Companies just maybe don't know where to look, that it was a search and knowledge problem. There was lots of discussion around pools like commercial banks, the big pools within the US government, green bonds, but in practice, alt protein companies were not securing financing or even getting much traction in those discussions. So our goal was to research what was going on and ultimately create this guide that provides a realistic assessment of the funding landscape to help alt protein companies make critical business decisions. Our scope, we initially focused on anything with a US angle. So US alt protein companies operating anywhere or non-US companies targeting the US market opportunity. And we really focused on the commercial manufacturing stage. So companies that were at least producing at a pilot or demo scale and had raised at least $20 million of funding. We spoke to over 30 companies and capital and solutions providers. We also formed an industry working group. I believe many of you have joined today. Thank you again for your contributions to this report. So that was our starting point. Let's move to some of the headlines next. Our first headline is that there's a systemic funding bottleneck for the commercial manufacturing of alt proteins. Systemic meaning that it affects all companies in the industry. The thing is, there is a lot of funding out there. Each year, the size of the US commercial bank market is over $200 billion. The US government, as many of you know, has made hundreds of billions of dollars of public capital available for climate change and clean tech. The problem is just that alt protein companies can't easily access it. And to give you a sense of the size of this funding gap, there's a statistic that to scale alt protein production to 10 million tons annually, which is just 2.5% of the expected global meat consumption in 2030. To do that, it will take $10 to $18 billion of funding, and that's just considering plant-based meat. If we consider fermentation and cultivated meat, it would be a higher figure. Compare that now to the fact that in 2023, the entire industry globally only raised $1.6 billion. So alt protein companies currently only have access to really just a fraction of the capital that they need to scale the industry significantly. So we asked, why is there this gap? Is it that capital providers lack knowledge about alt proteins? Is it because companies lack experience and knowledge about financial products to prepare funding applications and they don't know where to look? What we found fundamentally is that it boils down to a mismatch, and that's between the profile of many alt protein companies, which are, many of them are startups making novel foods. And that doesn't align well with the investment criteria of some of the largest capital providers. And what's really needed for commercial manufacturing is access to affordable long-term debt. And that's particularly difficult right now for alt protein companies to access. And I'll discuss this more in the presentation. So that brings us to the second headline, which is the good news. We did find bright spots on the funding landscape, and that's where funds are flowing. These are capital pools that are definitely part of the solution. So things like equipment leasing, sovereign wealth funds, some US government pools, and we even see venture capital returning to the industry, of course, in a much more measured way than before. But these are the pools that we found were working. But again, really to drive scale at an industry level, alt protein companies are going to need to access, again, the large pools of debt that sit within the commercial lending market and within the US government. That brings us to the third headline, which is that we found potential pathways to unlock these large pools. Solutions like blended finance, market shaping, institutional purchasing. And we're also seeing greater interest from the US government in funding alt proteins. So I'll talk about these more towards the end of the presentation, but what I'd like to emphasize right now is that these potential solutions that we identified, they're really multi-stakeholder in nature. So we believe it's going to be difficult for individual stakeholders, a company or a capital provider to pursue them alone. What we think it's really going to take different kinds of stakeholders coming together to problem solve in a very targeted way. That being said, our view is fundamentally that these financing bottlenecks are solvable. Next, let's move to the co-manufacturing decision. So we'd first like to emphasize that companies should thoroughly evaluate co-manufacturing and other asset-light approaches before proceeding to build their own facilities. And that's especially because capital is scarce and equity investors these days are increasingly favoring asset-light approaches. And co-man, for those that may be less familiar, it's essentially outsourcing manufacturing or some portion of the process to a third party that specializes in it. The feasibility of it varies a lot based on the technology, company stage, the company's own goals and their funding availability. But in general, we can say a few things. So first, for co-manufacturing, the advantages. We find that it can get products to market faster. It generally requires, of course, lower upfront investment. Companies can be more responsive to demand, so ramping production up or down. And some third parties can even help with development and design. Those are the CDMOs. But that being said, it can be hard to find suitable capacity. Companies do cede production control, and it's not very conducive to processes that still require iteration. Some of the other challenges with CoMan are that the unit costs can be higher, and some contract manufacturing organizations, the CMOs, they tend to prefer large, stable clients over smaller, short-term ones. On the self-owned facility side, it does require greater investment upfront, and it can take 2 to 3 years to build and commission a facility. It can also be risky to build before technology is proven at scale. Building your own facility does require manufacturing expertise, and there are more regulatory compliance aspects. But some of the advantages are that having your own facility, of course, can give you greater security over intellectual property, if that's something that's important to the business. And in the long run, it can be more cost effective. But, that being said, we found that suitable CoMans for some technologies are simply not available. So there is little choice in some cases, but for companies to build their own facility. So for companies that do decide that self-owned facilities are the correct model for expansion, we'll talk about the Capex requirements and the target funding mix now. Demonstration facilities, we found, typically cost between $1 to $20 million, and commercial facilities, the range we see is $15 million to $250 million or more. Now, I know these are wide ranges, and we can generally say that on the lower end of these ranges, we find the plant-based and biomass fermentation companies, while on the higher end of the range, you'll see precision fermentation and cultivated technologies. Some of the cost drivers besides technology are the facility size and location, and also whether the site is greenfield or brownfield, meaning is it an undeveloped plot or land, or does it already have some building and infrastructure on it already? We also, in our report, talk about the target funding mix for self-owned facilities. So the point here is that the funding mix changes as the company grows from pilot scale to commercial scale. You can see this with the two rings. The ring on the left shows that pilot plants, again, Capex of up to $20 million, those are typically funded mostly with equity capital and some grant funding. But as everyone knows, equity is expensive and it's scarce right now. So the ring on the right shows the early commercial stages and moving into the full commercial stages, which again, 15 million on the lower end, but we often see it in the $100 million to $200 million range. At this stage, companies should really ideally be funding 50% with affordable long-term debt. That will help lower the cost of funding and help companies move more rapidly towards price parity with conventional animal proteins. What you can also see in the ring on the right is that equity remains a critically important portion of the funding mix, even during the commercial stage. Here we show it at about 1/3. And the point here is that venture capital and other risk-tolerant sources of equity are going to remain a very important part of the picture, even as the companies scale. Next, we'll look at the funding side of the picture. So here we give a snapshot of the most commonly discussed capital pools, the large capital pools. The ones on the top row are currently funding alt proteins, and those in the second row, we found them to be largely out of reach. The report discusses each of these capital pools more, so I'll only briefly touch upon them now. First, let's start with venture capital. This is for early stage high growth companies. It'll continue, as I mentioned, to be an important source of equity for alt proteins, but it needs to come alongside other sources. We expect that this VC market correction that we've seen, we expect it to be at least a medium-term strategic shift. I'm looking forward to our panelist, Steve Molino from Clear Current Capital, discussing this more during the panel. But for now, I'll just say that VCs are focusing on high growth, high margin companies that have multiple approaches to achieving growth and profitability. So multiple products across multiple industries. They generally prefer platform technologies. That's what we're seeing, and companies that are cost reduction enablers. Then we have equipment leasing. This is when a finance company purchases equipment and leases it to a company. It's similar to leasing a car. we found that it's a viable short to medium term debt option, and it reduces the upfront CapEx outlay. We also found that it can cover up to 30% of a facility CapEx, which is, a fairly decent amount. Of course, it depends on the share of equipment in overall project cost, but we're finding that companies have been accessing this pool successfully. Next, we'll talk about sovereign wealth funds, and you'll get to hear more about this pool from Alessandro Borgogna, who's our panelist that has joined us from the Abu Dhabi Investment Office. He'll talk about this more during the panel, but for now, I'll mention some key points about the sovereign wealth funds that are in our report. We found that some US companies are looking at manufacturing outside of the US, for example, in regions like the Middle East and East Asia, and that's due to funding available from sovereign wealth funds, which are interested in enhancing food security and addressing water and land constraints, among other issues in their home country. The appeal for US companies is that sovereign wealth funds offer significant capital for large manufacturing facilities, and they can also support the development of the surrounding ecosystem. They provide, in many cases, flexible financing options, so grants, affordable debt, and equity. And our understanding, from the ones that we've looked at, they do take equity stakes when they provide equity, but they don't necessarily need control or intellectual property rights. So that was some of the advantages that the companies that were looking at sovereign wealth funds mentioned. We also found that sovereign wealth funds prefer technologies that are proven and scalable, and companies that can create jobs and promote local economic growth. But I think what we found is that these sovereign wealth funds may also be open to high potential pre-revenue companies that address critical national issues. Next, let's move to the US government programs. Molly O'Donnell from GFI will discuss these more during our panel, but the one I'd like to mention is USDA's Business and Industries program. It has about $1 billion of annual capacity, and it partially guarantees commercial bank loans for projects located in rural areas. It gives up to $25 million per project, so the amounts can be small compared to the Capex requirements of individual commercial facilities, but the loans come with below market interest rates thanks to the federal backing. Liberation Labs has secured a guarantee from the BNI program, and the co-founder, Atan Bentheim, is one of our panelists here today. In the second row, we show pools that alt protein companies have struggled to access. Private equity, which supports more mature later stage companies that have a track record of sales and profitability. We found that private equity isn't a good fit for early commercial manufacturing of alt proteins. It tends to be costly, and the time horizons of PE funds don't typically fit well with alt protein company timelines. PE investors, based on fund life and investment period and portfolio period, they typically seek profitable exits in about 5 to 7 years. They also tend to seek controlling stakes in the company, which may not work well for founders. And then we have commercial banks. This is really an ideal pool because commercial banks give long-term loans, but we found them to be largely out of reach for alt protein companies. They are among the most conservative capital providers, and that's in part because they're funded by depositors, savings from people like you and me. I'll discuss this more on the next slide, why it's difficult for early revenue companies to access this pool. So long-term capital providers like commercial banks, they derive comfort from several key company features. And the ones on this slide are just some examples. For example, so the first is financial strength. Banks want to see strong balance sheets with predictability of future cash flows, so that they have comfort that interest and principal will be repaid. Second, when it comes to construction, they want to ensure that costs remain within budget, so they'll look to the experience of your EPC contractor and the company's track record in finishing projects on time within budget. The key question here is, if costs run over, who's going to pay for it? They'd like visibility on that upfront. Third, they want to ensure that the company has operational expertise for manufacturing facilities. So this is a very different skill set than what it takes to run an R&D lab or a pilot facility. And fourth, they look at market risk. So is there demand for your product? How much? At what price? They want to see a proven track record of sales and revenue. And this comes back to the first point, the point on financial strength. There has to be sufficient cash flow to service the debt. So this is what providers like commercial banks want to see. Many alt protein companies today, however, are startups making novel foods. So their profiles don't match well with these investment criteria. And if we had to kind of point our finger, why this funding gap exists, fundamentally, it's because of this mismatch. You could frame it in terms of risk and say that the risk stack of an alt protein company, a typical alt protein company, doesn't align well with the risk appetite of certain large capital providers. Our report also includes a quick reference table on the commonly discussed capital pools. We show them here on this slide. Companies can get a quick sense of the different pools, a description of what they are, what they're designed to fund, which candidates, what types of companies make good candidates, and some of the key access challenges. And now I'll discuss two of our hot topics that arise in many of the discussions: project finance and long-term offtake. So both are solutions that have been key in funding large infrastructure projects globally. And that's why there's been a lot of talk about their potential to fund alt protein large facilities, commercial manufacturing facilities. Just a bit of background: project finance was originally developed to incentivize large strategic players that have deep pockets to invest in capital-intensive industries without exposing their entire corporation, to the risk of a single project. So in some sense, it was really to shield liability while encouraging investment. And it works particularly well in industries like energy, infrastructure, transportation, mining. And these are industries where projects do require substantial upfront CapEx, but they also, and this is very important, they have long-term visibility on future cash flows. This predictability of cash flows, which is so important, can either be through long-term offtake contracts, or if they're in absence of long-term contracts, which are not customary in all industries, it could be by selling products into markets or to customers where demand is well established and predictable. Those are keywords: well established and predictable. And long-term offtake contracts, just to clarify, these are output purchase agreements that give long-term visibility on revenue. So they're common in power, but they are very rare in the food industry. And I think this is a really important point that we'd like to highlight. In the food industry, as many of you know, buyers, they prefer shorter-term contracts that provide flexibility to adapt to changing consumer preferences, for example. So when people speak about offtake in food, they often mean non-binding LOIs or very short-term contracts. And I think, what we'd like to say is that it's worth clarifying when you hear this term offtake, what does it actually mean? And it would also be helpful when you use the term to be precise in how you use it, because it does, when you hear offtake, tends to mean, it tends to imply long-term contracts. And that we found that creates a lot of misunderstanding. Our view regarding long-term offtake contracts for food is that they are unlikely on their own to become a scalable solution. We do note, however, that this is one area where market shaping work is being done to unlock capital, and I'll talk more about that next. The other point I'd like to make on project finance is that, beyond market risk, it involves a very complex process of risk allocation. One example is that project finance lenders, as I mentioned, construction costs, they, to manage the risk of construction, they tend to prefer fixed price EPC contracts. And for alt protein companies that are already under pressure to reduce costs, these upfront expenses can be unviable. So now we'll move to our last section, which is, before we move to our panel, which is pathways forward and how to unlock capital. We have four areas or four ways that we identified through this process. The first is market shaping, which structures solutions to address market barriers. So it includes things like offtake guarantees, demand aggregation to remove supply chain bottlenecks. It can include technology transfer mechanisms that are used to transfer technologies between countries. Development of regulatory frameworks is also a form of market shaping. It can involve the use of concessional capital, but not necessarily. The second area is blended finance, and that's when concessional capital is strategically combined in a very structured way with philanthropic. So concessional capital from government or philanthropic sources, when you combine that in a very strategic way with private commercial capital. And really the idea is to lower investment barriers to mobilize larger volumes of private funding to flow into companies or into projects. And common forms include loan guarantees, which of course protect lenders against missed repayments, first loss structures that use catalytic capital to absorb losses on debt provided by other lenders. It can take the form of subsidized capital, so low interest rate loans or equity that accepts a lower rate of return to make projects viable. The key here is that the concessional funding in blended finance isn't standalone. It targets and removes the key barriers that prevent commercial capital from flowing. And I'll give 4 ideas we have on how alt proteins could benefit from blended finance. So the first, loan guarantees that protect lenders against market risk, which is one of the key issues that companies face, as I discussed. The second is low return patient equity that helps companies deliver minimal acceptable returns to commercial equity investors. Third, grants or equity for technical assistance or to pay for loan transaction costs, which can help early stage companies that have limited financial resources. And finally, subordinated debt that has deferrable repayments in periods of cash shortfall. So I'd like to mention that GFI is working on a project aimed at catalyzing the first of a kind blended finance transaction in the alt protein space. This is one of the follow-on actions from the findings of this report. The third pathway is institutional purchasing. So this is by schools, hospitals, and government agencies. The large predictable orders that come from institutional purchasing can reduce market risk and give private investors comfort in investing. It also gives companies the confidence to invest in scaling up production. So it can really lead to a virtuous cycle of investment and cost reduction and larger demand. And the last pathway I'd like to talk about is the US government. We're encouraged to see new funding opportunities for alt proteins that have been coming up increasingly to address American priorities in industrial decarbonization, biomanufacturing, and food security. And as I mentioned, Molly O'Donnell from GFI will tell us about this more now during our panel. So thank you very much for listening. On the last slide, we show links to our report. Sharon also provided that in the chat. And there's also a link to sign up for GFI's newsletter. If you have feedback on this, please do feel free to share that with us at the email here at the bottom of the slide. Thank you. And with that, I'd like to move to our panel discussion. Could our panelists please turn on your cameras and mics? All of you able to turn on your cameras? Okay, let's get started. Thank you. So thank you so much for joining us today. I'd first like to start by asking our panelists to each briefly introduce themselves. Eitan, may I start with you, please?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I am Eitan Benheim. I'm the Chief Business Officer and the co-founder of Liberation Labs. My background is in finance and in biotechnology, started in investment banking, and then spent over a decade in the pharmaceutical space before entering the synthetic biology precision fermentation space with a previous startup. Mark Warner, my co-founder, and I founded Liberation Labs in 2022 to address the biomanufacturing gap in large scale capacity. So we are planning on bringing about 25 million liters of precision fermentation capacity to the market over the next 10 to 15 years. And we are starting with this first facility that you can see behind me. So it's great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. And Eitan, is it correct that Liberation Labs has spoken to over 300 capital providers through this process? Is that accurate? That's a figure I heard.
I think we're closer to 250, but
250,
yeah.
Okay, so it's still a very large number, yeah. Thank you. Next, I'd like to turn to Alessandro Borgogna, who joins us to represent the perspective of sovereign wealth funds. Alessandro, thank you so much for joining us from Abu Dhabi in your evening time. Please go ahead.
First of all, thank you for inviting us to this amazing web webinar. So I am an advisor today in Abu Dhabi Investment Office, where we focus on developing 13 clusters. Among those clusters, we have the aqua cluster, which focuses on alternative protein. Before radio, I was an executive director in Mubadala, one of the sovereign wealth funds of Abu Dhabi, focusing across 5 investment platforms. And one of those was the food platform. And the idea was really to identify investment opportunity that fit the Abu Dhabi environment, also from an ecosystem and from the nature of this part of the world. And before working for Mubadala, I was a partner, a senior member of Strategy End, which is a consulting arm of PwC, serving a sovereign wealth fund, private company, and so on across different topics, especially around the investment part and how to deploy capital to develop the national economies. I am an aerospace engineer by background, and I did my MBA between US and Italy. And what I find super interesting is when you combine the creativity of Italy with the financial skill, the marketing skills of the US company, that can create amazing opportunities.
Great. Thank you, Alessandro, and we look forward to hearing more from you. Next, I'd like to turn it over to Steve Molino, who is here to discuss the current venture capital funding environment. Steve?
Yeah, thanks for having me. So my name's Steve Molino. I am an early stage investor in this space, so in the sustainable food space. And I lead the investment activity for a firm called Clear Current Capital. We focus on pre-seed through Series A companies in alt protein and then other areas within sustainable food, but we have a very heavy focus on alt protein. Yeah, my background is in finance and strategy consulting, and made the very intentional decision to focus on this space a number of years ago.
Great, thanks, Steve. And finally, we have Molly O'Donnell from GFI. Many of you recognize Molly as the bearer of good news, as she is regularly posting about US government funding opportunities. So, Molly?
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. So I'm the Senior Policy Specialist for Public Investment and Industry at the Good Food Institute, and my work focuses on identifying, communicating, and catalyzing public funding for alternative protein scale-up and commercialization. And many of you who are regulars at the Business of All Protein webinar series may remember that I previously was on GFI's corporate engagement team. So I've been super excited to shift into this role on our policy team that's really focused on sort of the intersection of policy and industry and investment.
Thanks, Molly. So a very warm welcome to all of you again. And again, thank you for making time to join us today. I'm sure our audience is eager to hear from you. So in my presentation, I talked about many of the challenges on the funding landscape. And I think many in our audience would be well oriented to those from direct experience. So I'd like to focus our panel today on what's working in terms of financing for alt protein commercialization, and also what actionable steps companies can take to secure funding. So let's start out with what's working. I'll first turn to the 3 panelists who represent our different capital pools. It would be great if you could share your perspective, from the perspective of your company or organization, as well as a broader perspective on the capital pool you represent. So, Alessandro, if I could start with you to talk about sovereign wealth funds, could you tell us about some of the key characteristics of companies that are garnering interest from sovereign wealth funds? What are the kind of specific company factors that sovereign wealth funds look for? And if you'd also like to mention what types of financing and terms are available today, we could start.
Okay. Thank you. First of all, Lopa, I want to specify that I was working for a sovereign wealth fund, and now I'm working for an agency of the Abu Dhabi government that behaves like a fund, but is not really a fund.
Yes.
But we are supporting in a different manner the alternative protein industry. So let's start with the sovereign wealth fund story. So typically, the role of the sovereign wealth fund is around the preservation of the wealth for the future generation. So if you keep this in mind, sovereign wealth fund typically they invest in order to minimize the risk, but also to optimize the return for their capital. And in the way that they structure their investments is extremely complex. So they look at different asset classes, different geographies, different sectors. And among the different asset classes, they have the venture capital, the private equity, the alternative investment, the infrastructure, and so on. Now, if you look at the alternative protein, where they have the majority of the company are close to revenue, so some of they already generated some revenue. So most of the companies that are in lab grow meat or in the precision fermentator are still pre-revenues. There are some challenges in interacting with the sovereign wealth fund because they look for low risk type of investments. So so if I needed to advise an alternative protein company in the way to approach a sovereign wealth fund, I would recommend them to look at 5 key items. The first one is the regulatory approval. Typically, sovereign wealth fund, they look for company that they already got a regulatory approval from one of the big agencies, such as FDA or the Singapore Food Authority or the European one. And this allows them to minimize the technology risk. Typically, sovereign wealth fund, they don't go in technology that are not yet proven, but they go in technology that are already proven. So the regulatory approval is very important for a sovereign wealth fund to consider that investment. The second key point is around the commercial viability. So typically, they look at companies that, I don't want to use the word offtake, but they already demonstrated that their product is viable and has some interest from the big distributors. So having a contract with the big retailers or big B2B type of business or sellers is extremely important for the assessment of the opportunity for the sovereign wealth fund. Third item that they look at typically is the cap table. So if in the cap table of the companies there are large reputable investors, they in some way they trust this type of investor. They are more prone for that type of investment because there is already some big player that is investing in that company. It gives some sort of comfort. The fourth point is the alternative protein company or the investor, then when they look at the sovereign wealth fund, they need to really understand their portfolio and identify synergies across the portfolio. Because if there's opportunity to distribute the product or to manufacturing the product to one of their companies, that provides another level of comfort that that company can be sustainable. The fifth point is the type of investment. Typically, especially the largest sovereign wealth fund, they go for very large ticket size. So going there for a pilot plant or typically does not work well. But going there for a large manufacturing plant that they can support, there is a certain level of commercial viability and so on, that is the preferred type of ticket. And typically, we are talking about over the $150 to $200 million. Now, it's a completely different story for the agency where I'm working on. We launched a few weeks ago, we launched the Aqua Cluster, which is a cluster focusing mainly on alternative protein. And in that role, we play a bit different from a sovereign wealth fund. We look at what is the potential GDP contribution of the company, what are the capital that the company can bring to the country. And based on that, we define a potential support packages to support that entity to succeed in our environment. And the other things that we do, we look at the overall ecosystem. So typically we connect that company with the distributor, with off-takers, with the suppliers of other source of capital, with financial institution that they have a loan backed by the government. And also, depending on the stage of the company, we connect them with the accelerator or with the research institute. So the perspective that we have now in ADIO is a bit different, because it's true that we are focusing on the business that have financial returns and that can be sustainable in the future, but we look at more on the economic return, on the impact that that company can have on our society. That's it,
Great.
on
Yeah,
my
thank
side.
you. Thank you, Alessandro. That was very informative and clear. I appreciate that. And we'll come back to talk about those opportunities more. Just for now, Molly, could I turn to you next to share insights on the US government funding opportunities? What types of funding is the US government currently providing for all proteins?
Yeah, absolutely. So this year has been the first time that GFI has actively tracked public funding opportunities for companies in the US. Lopa mentioned that I'm frequently sending out emails with new funding opportunities, and we actually have a public funding listserv. I believe my colleague Margaret will drop the link in the chat shortly for folks to sign up if you're interested in getting notifications. But since beginning this tracking, we've found a number of funding opportunities that alt protein companies can qualify for, but almost no opportunities that are specifically focused on alternative protein manufacturing. There have been a couple, but it's more so wider funding opportunities for biomanufacturing, for industrial decarbonization that alt protein companies can qualify for. And one of the largest sources of federal funding for companies to date has been the Small Business Innovation Research Program, or SBIR program. And that provides grants to small businesses for the purposes of commercializing scientific research. I saw a question come through about funding for R&D, so you might want to check that out. And we also have a fact sheet on the SBIR program, so definitely be sure to check that out if you're interested in learning more about that program. Since beginning this tracking, we've seen funding opportunities come from a variety of government agencies, including the Department of Energy, the National Science Foundation, the Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Defense. And most of these opportunities have ranged in the hundreds of thousands to several $1 million, which is still small compared to the enormous capital expenditure requirements that we know we need to scale this industry. But it's certainly encouraging that alternative protein innovation is within the mandate of multiple government agencies. And that really speaks to a strength of alternative proteins and why I think they're really attractive to policymakers, because they can serve a variety of policy goals, from sustainability to national security to public health to food security. So policymakers see alternative protein commercialization as a means to promote innovation, to promote global competitiveness, to create jobs, which is popular, across both aisles here in the United States and really across the world. And all of that being said, my work focuses on the US. That's what I'm best able to speak to today, but public funding for alternative proteins really is happening all over the world. GFI publishes an annual State of Global Policy report. Our 2023 report showed that Canada, the European Union, and Denmark were the 3 leading government entities for public funding in 2023. So I'd certainly love to see the United States catch up, but I do think the progress that we've seen this year is really encouraging.
Great, thank you, Molly. Steve, could I turn to you next to talk about venture capital? So I did mention that equity is going to be a critical component of the financing plan, even at the commercial scale. And VC is one of the few sources that's available right now. Can you tell us more about what VCs are focusing on now that they've recalibrated and are returning to the industry?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, at a high level, the role of VC is to look for opportunities that are going to be potentially high growth opportunities in short time frames, relatively short time frames. So like a 5 to 7 year period, which you mentioned, Lopa, when you were going through your presentation. So that idea of a recalibration, that is something that has occurred in the space. And I think a lot of companies have seen that and felt that. So there's a lot of companies that used to be funded that now necessarily aren't able to find VC funding as easily. And a lot of it is because of just the expectations around the growth potential and the time frame around that growth potential. And I could get into specifics if we want to, but in terms of the types of companies that we're seeing right now in the alt protein space that are getting VC funding and getting VC interest, it really is more around the B2B enabling technology companies across the different verticals within alt protein. So these are the ones that instead of creating a food product themselves, they might be having a technology solution that could be hardware, software, a combination of both, that reduces costs or reduces hurdles across the supply chain in whatever the respective industry is. And it's kind of enabling the entire space. So these would be the companies that are selling to the CPG brands or the fermentation companies, or even cultivated meat companies. And beyond that, a lot of interest is really in those technologies that are not only applicable to alt protein, but also to other industries. So a great example is there's a lot of interest right now in companies that are reducing either upstream or downstream processing costs in fermentation, whether that's precision or biomass fermentation, because that's a key hurdle and that can create value, but they're also applicable to anybody using fermentation as a technology to produce something. So that means it's applicable to pharma companies, biotech, et cetera. So that de-risks it from a revenue standpoint, it de-risks it from a funding standpoint, because that means it's not just alt protein VCs that are looking at it, it's also other VCs in those respective areas. So really B2B enabling tech that's applicable to more than just alt protein, that's like the highest level. And you also mentioned this idea of platform technologies being interesting. That is interesting. And for people listening, at least the way I think of platform technologies, it's really ones where if there's a company, let's say, that's creating a novel ingredient, a novel protein, that's great, but that's one ingredient, that's one product. So a platform tech company would be having some type of technology that allows them to create many different products. They start with a hero product, a hero ingredient, but they have some differentiated tech that allows them to go beyond just that initial product. Those can be interesting as well. But it does seem like the days of funding what was initially funded, those have changed, and it's really just because of expectations on growth profiles and time horizons around those profiles.
Thanks, Steve. Those specific examples you gave are helpful, I think, to just understand exactly what we're talking about here. Eitan, can I turn to you next to share the perspective of a company that's actively fundraising for an under construction facility? Where have you gotten traction? And what do you think are some of the top factors that have, that make equity and debt providers attracted to Liberation Labs?
Should have kept off mute. Sorry about that. Yeah, absolutely. So I highlighted a couple of things here for myself, and I'm happy to go into some more detail in the Q&A. So I think number one, in the current environment, you really can't get around venture capital for a first of a kind facility. Everyone really wants that long-term debt solution, but the reality is we are in a novel space. We're talking about novel proteins, and you're going to need venture capital at least to get off the ground. Now, choosing the right investors is really, I think, the thing that helped Liberation Labs get to where we are today. Flexible enough mandates to allow them to get past that all too common, quote, "We don't invest in Capex" in their mandate. Investors that can see past their shoelaces and understand that without investing in real Capex dollars, the rest of the investments, the billions of dollars that have gone into sort of the soft costs, the front end biology or what have you, can't be actualized. And we've really been blessed with capital partners who have the commitment to the space and the understanding for the need for biomanufacturing, really without which their other investments couldn't scale. Number two, and I think thinking back, Lopa, to your pie charts there, thinking critically about the capital stack and which groups can slot into it is really important. Really, there are no complete single solutions, and nor should there be really in a healthy funding mix. And so, Liberation Labs has, initially we were VC funded. We quickly added some of those equipment leases and a government loan guarantee, and are working with sovereign wealth as well. And it's a somewhat delicate dance in order to make sure that all those can exist in the capital stack, and thinking ahead of time to how each of those pieces can slot in is going to be critical to making sure that you're able to get them all in when the time is right. And then finally, I guess, piggybacking on Steve's comment here, building a flexible enough platform, however you define, the platform that you're building, so that you can answer with a straight face the what if this doesn't work? What's plan B? And if you have a solid enough answer for that says, hey, this is a great platform for this other very strong existing market, that will give investors, especially the lower kind of the more conservative ones, a lot more comfort in order to get into your round.
Great, thank you. I'll maybe open this next one up to anyone who'd like to respond. When we talk about what companies can do, I think many of you did touch upon this in terms of business model choices and other aspects. But if what really can, how do companies approach capital providers? What's the best way? Sometimes it's difficult to figure out how to make those connections or to present yourself. What's the best way to present yourself? Of course, that should vary based on who you're talking to, but also have a high degree of consistency so that you're not telling a different story to different providers. Any words of advice on accessing, engaging, and presenting a company?
I'll jump in here because I'm already off mute. I'd say, again, highlighting, Lopa, what you said earlier about co-manufacturing first, and this is partially a plug for Liberation Labs, but also I think really important, know what you are and what you aren't. Not every company is built to go from soup to nuts, and not every company especially is built for manufacturing, and that's okay. There exists an entire industry across every single industry for co-manufacturing, really almost except for in kind of industrial biotech, and that needs to change, I think, for this industry to be successful. So there's really no shame in your company saying, drawing the line in the sand for your investors or your potential investors and saying, our technology is going to get us here, and then we're going to partner for the rest. Number two, if you do decide to build, you obviously need to come with not just a plan of, we're going to develop this technology and then build a factory and be vertically integrated and it's going to be great. Have a plan for how your team, the team that you have now, your expertise, your skill sets are going to get you from where you are today to a defined facility, right? Something that has, clear metrics around, you don't have to have a floor plan yet, but a, size, output, what the key kind of cost metrics are going to be, so that you can go to a funder or a large CPG partner or a sovereign wealth partner or a bank at some point and say, this is the stage gate. This is where we need to be, and it's something that they'll recognize as, hey, this is something that we would have built or we would normally fund, and so this is a recognizable output for us. And then number three, it's really never too early to engage with customers. The power of a robust stable of LOIs, and people laugh at LOIs, but really, LOIs with the right kinds of companies at very early stages, and then even better, a conditional or even a solid offtake. Agreeing with what Lopa said, that offtakes are short term, and you're not going to get a 10-year kind of power like offtake, but a shorter term 3 to 5 years even is forever in the food space. And if it's conditional on your build, that's fine. But that's really the power of those agreements with potential customers shouldn't be understated.
Thank you so much. Would anyone else like to comment?
Yeah, I can jump in from the government funding side. So government grant applications do vary widely in terms of what they're asking, but one kind of general tip that I would give is really paying careful attention to the solicitation and understanding what they're asking for. So most funding opportunities typically have what's called a problem statement or a topic area description that explains the purpose of that specific solicitation and why whichever agency is releasing it is releasing it. So essentially the policy goal that they're trying to meet and the problem that they're trying to solve. So being able to make sure that your application is responsive with a high level of specificity to that particular problem statement is really important. So just as a specific example, earlier this year, the Department of Energy released a funding opportunity announcement that had a topic area that was called decarbonizing alternative protein production. So for a solicitation like this, it would be really important to respond to the intersection of alt proteins and decarbonization, since that's really what they were looking for. As another example, USDA earlier this year had a funding opportunity that focused on ag technology research that was at the intersection of human health, climate smart agriculture, and social equity. So it would have been really important to make sure that your application was really showcasing how your technology sort of responds to those specific topic areas. So it's hard to draw generalizations when it comes to government grant applications, but that is one thing that I would say.
Yeah, thanks, Molly. I think the specific guidance is very helpful for companies that want to take actions.
Maybe,
yeah, please.
yeah, maybe just a small addition to what my colleague said. It's very important to have a great team, because if you go for a large scale project where you're going to build a large facility, especially those for the sovereign wealth funds or entity like us, it's important that you show that you have the capability in what you're going to deliver. So if you go for a large manufacturing plant, you have a chief operations that come from a food manufacturing company with experience on delivery. You have a chief commercial officers that have the experience in dealing with large retailer or large wholesalers. That makes the plan extremely credible. And in addition to that, also the technology team. So if you're building fermenters, you want that there are people that they already done that, even though in other industries like life science or enzyme and so on, because the credibility of the team will influence also they will influence a lot the decision-making process of an investor.
Thank you, Alessandro. I think that point about credibility and experience is a common theme across capital providers, many of the larger capital providers that are out there. Okay, so maybe I'll just turn us, we have a couple more minutes left for the panel. I'd like to talk about some of the potential pathways, and in my presentation, just to recap, I talked about 4 of them that GFI had identified. Those were market shaping, blended finance, institutional purchasing, and the US government programs. Do any of our panelists, any of you have thoughts on these ideas or additional ideas on what specifically can be done to unlock these large pools? It would be great to hear your thoughts on this.
I'm happy to jump in again. So for us, we think the lowest hanging fruit is the government programs. For example, so we received this USDA loan guarantee under the BNI program that Lopa, you mentioned. There was another $40 million program that was authorized by USDA under COVID for securing the food supply chain that was rescinded under the latest budget cycle. There's a bipartisan legislation that's been in committee put forth to reinstate the program, but it's not made a lot of progress. Making that program permanent could make it a mainstay of bringing safe biomanufactured food to our domestic supply chain. But the reality is that the majority of the biomanufacturing focused government programs right now are really not focused on large scale manufacturing, although it may be in their name. And so we really need, I think, government and these programs again exist, but they just need to be repurposed to focus on things, TRL level 7 or above, just really large scale manufacturing, and that can drive a lot of the progress that needs to get made.
Yeah, no, I think, thank you for raising that. We also, when we were looking at this, we had heard that other countries had, where, as Molly mentioned, moved further than the US in supporting commercial scale manufacturing. But at least in some of the providers we spoke to, when we drove, kind of dug into those details, what we found, it was the same story, that it's still really just for R&D. But there, for the later stage funding, that's still not as there. It's just there isn't that much funding out there for those later stages, and that was an area for work even in some of the other countries that Molly mentioned.
That's a good segue for me to jump
Yes.
in. Yeah, I want to call out two things. One is a program and a type of policy intervention that I'm really excited about, which is the Department of Energy has a voucher program that provides vouchers to companies for conducting planning and manufacturing activities from DOE-approved service providers. And some of these activities are life cycle assessments, techno-economic assessments, commercialization or go-to-market strategy, engineering. And this program is really exciting, I think, because it can help companies conduct some of those manufacturing planning activities that might de-risk for other investors. So it's non-dilutive funding to help support companies getting to that stage of manufacturing readiness. The first call for voucher recipients just closed. And so we have yet to see if any alt protein companies received any of those vouchers. But I think that program is really exciting. And DOE has indicated that they'll release more calls for voucher recipients in the future. So I think that's a program to keep an eye on, and also an intervention that I think is replicable potentially in states and other countries. So that's one thing I'm excited about. And then another sort of general mission area for the government that I think is really exciting is space applications for alternative proteins. We just saw NASA and the Canadian Space Agency just finished their multi-year Deep Space Food Challenge that was dedicated to finding novel food production systems for supporting astronauts during long-duration space missions. And we saw multiple alternative protein companies receive awards at each phase of that challenge. And one company, Solar Foods, which is a gas fermentation company based in Finland, received an award in phase 3 of that challenge, which just wrapped up. And space manufacturing might not be an application that a lot of folks have thought of, or maybe you have, but I think it's a really interesting and exciting one, since all protein production can have modular production systems and can be produced in low resource environments, including space, including military bases. They also have the potential for circularity. So I think that's really interesting and exciting from a government perspective. And final thing to call out here, there is actually an SBIR notice out right now for biomanufacturing processes that can be used in space, which I see Margaret just dropped into the chat. So for folks that think their production processes could work in a space environment, definitely check that one out.
Thanks, Molly. Unless are there any final comments from our panelists? Yes, Alessandro, please go ahead.
Yeah, very quickly. Something that we are doing in Abu Dhabi is because we recognize that capital is a major constraint for the alternative protein companies. What we did, we tried to align all the stakeholders along with the same vision. So we have an arm that is called the ATRC that focuses mainly on research, development, grants, and support. So this is where we channel the company that are still at TRL like 5 to 7. Then we set it up an accelerator program where we focus on startups where the product is close to prototype or they are in advanced industrialization phase. And finally, with ADIO, what we do, we support the alternative protein to structure their capital, especially for large-scale projects. So we work with them to say which is the part of the capital requirements that can go for leasing, which part of their Capex can be funded to a loan, a long-term loan backed by the government, what is the support need from the government itself. And then we partner with the Sovereign Wealth Fund, especially if the project is a large scale, to finance the remaining part, the equity part. So what we try to do is really to breach the capital needs for those companies by aligning all the stakeholders across the life cycle of a company. And that really is helping us to build an ecosystem around the alternative protein sector.
Thank you.
Which is quite valuable,
yeah,
especially for someone that comes from the Western economy, where putting all these different stakeholders together is quite difficult. Instead, in Abu Dhabi, it's quite easy because all those stakeholders are one phone call away.
Yeah.
And getting all of them aligned on the same objective is quite easy.
Yeah, thank you, Alessandro. I think that's a very important point. It's not just about opening up new pools, but really that advisory and support to companies can be a really, really critical piece. So thank you for mentioning that. Okay, well, with that, thank you. I'll wrap up the panel portion of this webinar. Thank you all again very much for your insights and for your time. I would like to now hand it over to Sharon Murray, who is GFI's Senior Manager for Investor Engagement and Financing, to run the Q&A session.
Well, thank you, Lopa, and thank all of you. We've already gotten so many questions, so we're just going to jump right in, get to as many of them as we can. And those that we don't get to, I'll provide an email address at the end for you all to send us, and we'll try to follow up after the session. So this first one is kind of an overarching question, which I can start with because it specifically asks for GFI's view, and then would love for Steve in particular, others to jump in. And that is, they're noting that VCs are not investing as much. Debt is focused more on CapEx, and they're noting that there's a large gap in just kind of funding payroll and R&D for companies, which is fair. And they're, concerned that many of the alternative protein companies that are in the kind of Series A+ range will run out of money and leave just kind of early stage companies in the industry that will take time to scale to commercial progress. And they're asking what GFI thinks about this issue. I'll just note that, yes, of course, it is a difficult environment. There are certainly risks of companies not surviving. We're starting to see that is not unexpected, though, of course, unfortunate in a nascent industry like alternative proteins. We are seeing some of these companies being acquired or recapitalized, so we'll likely see kind of all three moving forward in the industry. That being said, we are seeing venture capital start to stabilize from its trough, and that's both VC broadly as well as for alternative proteins. And so hopefully that will support the strong alternative protein companies in surviving. Steve, I'd love for you to jump in because there was another question later that also asks on, saying that VC has been in a risk-off mindset, and are we seeing that starting to change? Are VCs looking or expecting a revenue stream in place already when they invest?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I think to the first idea of at least starting to see the VC space stabilize and all that, I do agree that it is starting to stabilize, especially at the early stage. Valuations have become more reasonable, and a lot of the innovations that we're seeing are differentiated, where there was a period of time where a lot of companies were starting where they really weren't that much different than a lot of the other companies that existed. So it's a good thing to see a lot of the innovation be truly differentiated and have potential to drive impact and change. I do think there's just always going to be that risk that past Series A, we're going to see kind of a cliff, because when you look at the space, there's a number of VCs that are kind of similar to myself and ClearCurrent, where we invest at the early stage, so pre-seed through Series A, maybe Series B. At the growth stages, there are just less investors that are dedicated to this space. And whether we like it or not, the return profiles and the business models of companies in alt protein at growth stage, they just look less attractive to generalist investors who could invest in anything at that stage, because there is CapEx and there are longer time horizons. So there are more growth stage investors that are popping up, which is good, not enough, but there are some popping up. But I think that risk at the growth stage will just be there, at least for the short to medium term, and we'll see how that plays out. I'd love to be wrong on that one, but and then what was the second question again?
I think you've essentially addressed it. It's just the VC appetite for investment today.
Yeah, I mean, the VC appetite is always going to be there, right? Like at the end of the day, the way that we're structured, at least if you're a traditional VC, is like we raise funds from other investors, from limited partners. It's not our money. And we give them a promise on a return profile within a certain time frame. So it's our fiduciary duty to find investments that meet that. So if we raise a fund and we don't invest, we're not doing what our jobs are. So the appetite will always be there. I think it's what the appetite is available for is very, very different. And at the end of the day, it all just comes down to demand and what the perceived demand of something will be. So I know that a lot of companies in our space, they might be plant-based CPG. That's one that gets hit the hardest right now. That's one that everyone is really, really feeling a lot of the pain in. And I think it's just because there was this perceived demand that was going to be astronomical for plant-based CPG, and it didn't pan out to be the case. Maybe it changes, and maybe long term it's there, right? But right now, we've seen a little bit of a plateau in plant-based CPG, which is why investors have shifted away. So it's not that the appetite for risk is gone; it's that they're willing to take the risk if the expected return is in line with what they promised their investors. So I think the risk appetite will always be there. It's just the perception of where there's opportunities and growth that has shifted.
Thank you. All right, our next one is for Alessandro, and it's asking, sovereign wealth funds, this person says, seem to be shifting away from food and acting more, in their view, like private equity firms in terms of wanting to see commercial traction. They're asking that, and then they say they also are requiring local partnerships, commitments, for example, opening a facility in Abu Dhabi. They're asking, should alternative protein companies choose one sovereign wealth fund in region, go all in and prioritize that geography?
Okay, addressing the first question, they're shifting away from food. No, they are not. I mean, sovereign wealth fund invest part of their capital in the local economies. And when they invest in the local economies, they really look at what is important for the country. So what is the national security team that they need to support? And among those, there is the food security. So, and especially in this region, alternative protein can be one of the solutions to become a net exporter of food, because we are blessed with a low cost of energy, a better cost of capital, and being those key parameters, key cost items, key cost drivers for a precision fermentation plant. That is an area where most of the sovereign wealth funds in the region are focusing on. Second question was, they are behaving like a private equity. Partially, yes, because one of the key mandates is the preservation of capital. So they don't play like a venture capital, but they invest their money across different asset classes, different type of business in order to optimize the risk profile. But food is one of the topic, and especially if it is related to the country. The third point is around shall I go in with one or two? The challenge is not really one or two. The challenge is where you build your plant. Because if a sovereign wealth fund is supporting a company for a national security objective, obviously they want the plant to be built in their own country. So, and typically, if you build the plant in that country, the other sovereign wealth fund from another country will say, I will not invest. However, sovereign wealth fund, they collaborate a lot. They co-invest across different topics, different companies, and so on. So typically, if you find the right sovereign wealth fund that collaborate with another one, you can find an opportunity to have two partners. Such as, when I was in Mubadala, we were collaborating with all the sovereign wealth fund in the region and beyond. And sometimes we were doing joint investments. So the opportunity is there.
Thank you. That's incredibly helpful. I would love to turn to a few questions on the U.S. federal and state opportunities. So these will be for Molly. So the first is looking forward. We have, of course, as we all know, an election coming up in November, and this person is wondering how a potential change in administration might impact the public funding landscape.
Yeah, sure. So I'll first take this opportunity to sort of remind and clarify for everyone that GFI is a nonpartisan 501c3 organization. So we don't endorse candidates, we don't play any role in influencing the outcome of elections, and we don't really have a stance on which candidates could impact, policies. So no matter the election outcome, we'll continue the work that we've been doing, identifying and distributing funding opportunities, and also providing our expertise to federal agencies through comment letters and through direct engagement. And as I mentioned earlier in the panel discussion, there are really bipartisan motivators for funding alternative proteins that we believe policymakers and citizens across the country can agree on. Things like national and food security, public health, boosting national competitiveness and food sovereignty, creating good jobs. So I'm really hopeful that we'll see public funding progress continue across the US, both at the federal level and in states. And as I also mentioned earlier in the panel, it's not just the US. I think this progress is happening all around the world.
Thank you, that's really helpful. And then on state funding opportunity, so Ram asks, what about state level funding? In Maryland, where I lived until recently, we had Maryland Tech Council, Montgomery County Economic Development Commission for guidance and connections, and TEDCO for funding. I guess the question is probably more broadly, how can companies access state level funding?
Yeah, it's a great question. And GFI has not done a full mapping of state opportunities, mostly due to bandwidth. Started, this work stream in April. So we've been busy mapping out sort of the federal landscape. But states can certainly be an opportunity. And we've seen sort of in an ad hoc way, different states have R&D funding or tax incentives for constructing facilities. A lot of states have federal matching funds or complementary fundings when startups receive federal grants, like through the SBIR program I mentioned. Some states have matching programs for that. So yes, I do think that that states can be a significant and exciting source of funding. Check sizes do tend to be a little bit smaller in states, just because states have smaller budgets than the US federal government. But certainly, something for startups to look into.
I could just jump in there very quickly. We've had, in our site selection process, the state itself was not primary, but when we did select Indiana, we did get an incentive package through the Indiana Economic Development Corporation and the local, sort of the Richmond, the neighborhood that we're in. All told about 10% of the project cost through tax incentives, power rebates, and the like. No hard cash, but significant funding for sort of the overall project.
Thank you, Eitan. You read my mind. I was just about to ask you from your experience, so thank you for that. Okay, moving on. This question is going to be for Lopa. So the person's asking if companies can use debt or project financing for OpEx. I note that many companies aren't yet ready to build large infrastructure projects and may not be ready for those capital types.
So again, project finance, I think if I could make a general statement with that, I think our finding was that it's for many reasons going to be difficult to make alt protein projects fit with the project finance model. That's kind of one general statement I'd like to make just based on what I found looking into this. That being said, for companies that do manage to, the investment profiles do fit, project finance in your project cost, you can include some funding for, there's an acknowledgement that, there won't be revenue right away, or it won't be full debt service capacity. The cash flows may take time to ramp up. So there is a period in that time where you could include funding for some working capital and, some operating expenses in that time. But I think really, and I think I would ask you to look at the report here as well, where we talk about pools like working capital and receivables factoring and things like that. So again, the premise of debt in today's market, I think it was a bit different a couple of years ago, but the premise, the kind of foundation for debt is cash flow. So if you have cash flows coming in, there is a basis for you to make an argument to borrow, so that lenders ultimately want to make sure that you can repay, and that's kind of the fundamental point I'll make. So then the details vary company to company.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Okay, this next one is probably best answered by Steve, but the others can jump in and I may add a little. So One is speaking about climate sustainability and food VCs. This person's saying they don't seem to be doing deals after seed or Series A. And even for those rounds, they're holding onto their capital for the earlier stage. How should startups think about pitching these funds, given how inactive they've been over the last few years and how they appear less interested in staying with companies for multiple years?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think the reality is the investment strategy differs by fund, right? So it's not just like there's a blanketed all venture capitalists invest a certain way, and that's how you should pitch VCs. I think there's a mix of VCs where they focus only on a specific stage, and then there's some firms that can be a little bit more balanced and invest across early and later stage. So I think you need to just really understand who you're talking to when you're when you're trying to raise capital. So if you raise capital from someone like my firm, for instance, if we invest in you at pre-seed, then there's a chance that we can invest in you at seed and Series A, because that's where we play. But if our first investment's at Series A, then maybe there's a chance that we can do one follow-on round. But then after that, really the size of our fund doesn't make sense for us to continue to follow on, because then we wouldn't be able to invest in a diversified portfolio of companies. So if a company is really trying to find investors who will be with them from the start, you kind of, the best approach is really to find like the growth stage investors who dabble at the early stages. So maybe you've seen a growth stage investor that comes in at seed sometimes, seed or Series A, and that's in a perfect world, right? Like I'm saying, to do that, that's very difficult to find those investors. But if you can do that, then there's a potential that if you're hitting the milestones that you set out for yourselves and that they agreed to, that as you go to raise their next rounds, they'll want to be participants. And they're incentivized to do that as well, because they want to limit their dilution. So if you are really doing well, then most investors want to continue. But it is overall rare to find investors in the private space that will go from pre-seed or seed all the way through Series B plus. It's just, that's generally not the approach to most VC funds.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe I'll add a little bit from what we see in speaking with investors. Part of the question was on sustainability investors and their kind of lower amount of investment in all proteins. And, I think that is partially just true, right? And when we had a lot of venture capital investment in 2021 in particular, we saw climate funds really recognize the role alternative proteins can play in meeting their mandates and investing. But many of them were doing so outside of kind of their core comfort area of their mandate where they were used to investing. And so when we have investors become more risk off, it's just natural that they're going to retreat right to their kind of core competencies. So we have seen some of that retreat. We are seeing some of that come back. And then, when you're talking out to later stage climate investors, so kind of growth Series B and above that Steve was speaking to before, many of them have more stringent requirements on revenue and profitability that they want to see. And part of those requirements are based on the kinds of companies they're used to investing in, right? What they typically see at a Series B for another sector in climate might be different from alternative proteins, especially higher tech alt proteins. For some of those are just, kind of set in their mandate and they can't really deviate from them. There's unfortunately not all that much we can do. For some of those, though, there probably is room for education to explain to them, why at maybe Series B, an alt protein company may look different than a company in another sector, and perhaps show them kind of other things that can get them comfortable with the stage of the alternative protein company. I think many of the points Alessandro made earlier on what sovereign wealth fund might look for that others have made. So that might be LOIs, evidence of repeat purchase orders, even at smaller sizes, kind of regulatory hurdles being overcome and more. So there might be more of a kind of educational aspect to that. And then kind of the last thing is for many of the climate funds, sustainability funds, especially at later stages, they want to see evidence for your impact. So especially from LCAs, and that actually earmarks really well into another question we got, which is if there are widely accepted resources that investors respect, that provide kind of standardized data for alternative protein company LCA results. And we have some GFI resources, which I can mention, but I'd love to hear from the investors here or Eitan from your engagement with investors, if there are specific resources on LCA data for alt proteins that you rely on.
I mean, I can jump in on that. I don't, the short answer for me, at least, and I'm just one investor, is no, there's not just a resource where it's like, this is the LCA that you should be doing, or these are the resources you should be using for that. Like whenever we get an LCA, we dig into it deeply. And we talked to obviously the company and the management team, but then also the firm that worked on the LCA. Generally, most companies are using some type of outside third-party service provider for it. And we dig into all of the assumptions and everything that's in there and really try to understand what we agree with, not agree with, and just how it works. I wouldn't say that there's just one company or resource for LCAs where we say, oh, if you use that, then we're happy with it. And maybe others feel differently. And I'm sure that there's some that are just have better reputations, but we don't necessarily take anything at face value just based on where they're getting the LCA from.
Yeah, I'll add, we've seen LCAs met with a fair amount of skepticism in general. From Liberation Labs perspective, because we're a co-manufacturer, we don't have necessarily our own carbon impact, because it'll depend heavily on the customer that we're producing for, right? If we're replacing cow's milk, that's very different than replacing sustainable aviation fuel or what have you. But we do see quite a bit of skepticism around the LCAs that have been circulating in the market, especially on the dairy side, without calling out anyone in particular. We would like to see, and there's been some initiatives, I think outside of GFI, but also within GFI, to see some standardization done there.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, Margaret, my colleague, pasted a few links from the GFI side on both data that we have out there, as well as resources for companies in conducting LCAs. So please take a look at that if you're interested. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. We have so many questions. So perhaps this last one, I'll just open up to anyone who wants to answer, and then we'll wrap up and we'll try to respond to the questions we didn't get to via email. This last question is that, it seems like a lot of generalist investors got burned out by the first wave of alternative protein, companies making big promises and maybe timelines taking longer than expected. This person's asking if those funders are worth approaching again, or do we think that they're just out of food at this point?
I mean, any founder or CEO will probably tell you it's going to take a lot of conversations to close a funding round. I think that the best approach is to build a list of investors you want to talk to that you think are target potential investors and prioritize it. So I wouldn't say spend a ton of time on the ones that are generalists and have clearly pulled out of the market, or you've heard are pulling out. But if you've gone through your list, or you think you have the bandwidth to also pursue some of the generalists who maybe dabbled in this space in the past, and you have a warm introduction to some of them from someone in your network, definitely have the conversation. The worst thing that could happen is they say no. The next best thing is they may intro you to someone that they know that is now considering it. And then maybe there's the off chance that they're reconsidering this space. So, but I would say prioritize. Fundraising is a long and hard process. And if you're just going after everyone and anyone, it's gonna be inefficient. You'll waste a lot of time.
Anybody like to add to that before we wrap up here? Okay. Well, thank you again, everyone, so much for your time today, Lopa, for taking us through the conclusions from all your research on funding the build, all of our panelists for helping bring some of these opportunities for companies to life, and for getting specifics and really answering so many of the questions that we got from our highly engaged audience. And apologies that we didn't get to all of them. This would have to last several hours for us to truly get there. So anyone whose questions we did not answer, feel free to follow up with us at corporate@gfi.org, and maybe someone can drop that in the chat for everyone, and we'll get to it via email or schedule a follow-up. Look, hopefully today's session, it's clear, right? Financing is absolutely critical for our industry to continue to thrive and to feed the world sustainably, securely, and safely. I hope that the webinar today showed you all that companies do have options, and that through collaboration, effort, creativity, and patience, there are going to be more possibilities that emerge. As GFI continues to drive progress in this area, we genuinely encourage all of you to share your ideas and feedback with us. So again, that email corporate@gfi.org, please reach out. We want to hear from you and make sure we can support the industry as best as we can. And so lastly, thank you all again so much, and enjoy the rest of your day.